I'm a 34-year-old guy, and this happened last year on New Year's Eve. My friends and I had plans to go out and celebrate, and I was looking forward to it. There were 5 of us in the group: me, Alex, Sean, Brian, and Joel. I got along well with everyone except Joel. Lately, he and I had been arguing a lot. It was stupid stuff most of the time, but we were getting on each other's nerves way too much. I considered skipping out on the night just to avoid dealing with him, but I didn't want to miss out on celebrating with the others, so I figured I could handle it. We met up at Brian's place first, and everyone was there except Joel. We had dinner and a few drinks, then we met up with Joel at a bar downtown. At first things were fine. We had a few drinks, joked around, and the atmosphere was good. But after a while, Joel started getting on my nerves. He made a few snide comments, things I would have ignored on another night, but I wasn't in the mood to let them slide. I didn't let it go, and before long, we were pretty pissed off at each other. The others tried to smooth things over and steer the conversation elsewhere, but it didn't really help. The more I drank, the more irritated I got. It wasn't a full-blown fight or anything, just a lot of passive-aggressive jabs back and forth, and it put a damper on the night, at least for me. By the time we left the last bar, I was exhausted both physically and mentally. It was around 2 a.m. when I got home. I was still slightly drunk and nursing a pounding headache. I took off my shoes, dropped my jacket on the floor, and collapsed onto the couch. I just wanted to rest for a bit before heading upstairs, but after a few minutes, the doorbell rang. My first thought was that it was one of my friends stopping by for some reason, but I didn't feel like dealing with anyone, so I ignored it. But the doorbell rang again and again. I considered getting up to check, but I was too drained. If it was important, they'd call my phone. After a minute or two, the ringing stopped. I relaxed on the couch for a bit longer, then dragged myself upstairs to bed. I lay down, hoping the headache would ease up enough for me to fall asleep. The room was spinning slightly, and I was just starting to drift off, but then I heard a noise downstairs. I lived alone, so there was no good explanation for it. I wasn't sure if I had locked the door when I came in, so I was worried that I was being robbed. But the footsteps in my house were loud. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be quiet. I reached for my phone, but it wasn't on the nightstand where I usually left it. I must have dropped it in the living room. I considered getting up to lock my bedroom door, but before I could, the footsteps got closer. They were coming up the stairs. Then my bedroom door burst open. Before I could react, Joel stormed in, and he looked mad. He came straight for me and yanked me out of bed, slamming me onto the floor. The shock of it knocked the breath out of me, and before I could get away, he started throwing punches. I barely had time to cover up as his fist came down on me. I struggled and tried to get out from under him, but he was on top of me, his weight pinning me down. He was shouting, but I barely registered the words. I tried to shove him off, but he was too strong. His fists kept coming, hitting my arms, my ribs, and my face. I didn't understand why he was doing this. The arguments we'd had were not that serious, nothing that should have led to this. I managed to get one of my legs up and kicked him in the side, giving myself just enough room to roll away. I crawled toward the door, but before I could reach it, I heard him shout after me. I turned and looked back out of instinct, and Joel was holding a knife. It was one of mine from my kitchen. I froze for half a second and kept trying to scramble away. Keep in mind that I was drunk, and I had already taken a few punches, so I was pretty out of it. Then I hit the nightstand hard and knocked over a lamp. Then he stumbled, and the knife slipped from his grip, landing right next to me on the floor. I grabbed it before he could, and I pointed the blade at him. For the first time that night, Joel looked scared. He stared at the knife, then at me, and then he bolted. He ran out of the room and down the stairs while I stood there, gripping the knife so hard my fingers ached. I didn't move until I heard the front door slam shut. I sat down onto the floor, gasping for breath. My arms hurt, my face throbbed, and my mind was still struggling to process what had just happened. I sat there for what felt like forever, staring at the door. After a while, I went downstairs to find my phone so I could call the cops. It was in one of the cracks of the couch, and as soon as I picked it up, it started ringing. I looked at the caller ID, and it was Joel. I stared at the small screen in disbelief for a few seconds, then I answered. As soon as I put it up to my ear, he started talking fast, apologizing over and over. He was begging me not to call the cops, saying that he had just lost control. I barely said anything back to him, because I was still too shaken to think about it. Eventually, I told him I wouldn't call the cops, just so I could end the conversation. Then I hung up and sat there in silence. When I woke up in the morning, my body ached all over. My face was sore, and I had bruises forming on my arms. Then I went downstairs and saw the front door hanging off its hinges. He had kicked it open, and that was when I decided to call the cops. Joel was arrested later that day, and he admitted to everything. There was no excuse, no justification, just a pathetic apology. The police took it seriously, and my friends did too. None of them defended him, and they cut him off completely. I spent the next few weeks dealing with the aftermath. I had to get my door fixed, and I explained everything to my landlord. My friends checked in on me too, and eventually life went back to normal, but I never stopped thinking about that night. I never thought someone I knew could do something like that, but I learned the hard way that you don't always know what people are capable of. When I was 14, I moved in with my grandparents after my mom got a job overseas. My dad wasn't in the picture, so this was the only option. Their house was in the woods, down a long gravel road, and it was pretty far from town. I could walk when I needed to, but it took a pretty long time. They weren't much for driving at their age, and they stayed home as much as they could. So most mornings, I had to walk or bike the 5 miles to school. It wasn't the worst thing, but it made everything harder. If I needed anything from a store, I had to plan ahead. If I wanted to go anywhere, I was on my own most of the time. My grandfather had an old truck, but I didn't have my license at the time. My grandparents were decent people, but they were in their 70s and didn't have the energy to keep up with me. They fed me, gave me a place to sleep, and left me alone. They weren't strict, but I mostly had to fend for myself. I'd only been in the area for a month when school started, and I didn't know anyone. The other kids had grown up together, and I was just some quiet kid who showed up one day. No one was mean to me, but no one really talked to me either. That changed when I met Robert. He was in my history and science classes, and he stood out. He was big for his age, broad-shouldered and tall, with a face that looked older than 16. He had been held back a year, which kind of explained how he looked. He was kind of a troublemaker, and he wasn't afraid of getting in fights or skipping school. I wasn't sure why he started talking to me, but I didn't question it. He was my first and only friend in that school, so I was glad to meet him at first. At lunch, I sat with him, and we'd talk about video games, teachers, or whatever else came up. He had a dry sense of humor and could make me laugh. I never asked too many questions about his life, and he never asked about mine. He had a way of carrying himself that made people give him space, and I felt like that extended to me just by being around him. We started hanging out after school sometimes too. He lived with his older brother, who didn't seem to care where he was most of the time. Since I didn't have a ride home, I usually just biked back before it got too late. Robert never asked to come over, and I hadn't invited him yet. My grandparents wouldn't have cared, but it just didn't come up. After about a month, he started telling me about his other friends. He had a few guys he hung out with outside of school. They were older, which would explain why I never saw them around at school. Then one Friday, he asked if I wanted to hang out at my place. My grandparents were out of town visiting family, and I didn't see any reason to say no. I told him to come by after dark since I had chores to do. Robert showed up around 8. I had already started a fire in the pit out back, and we sat around it talking. He looked around, taking in the property. "Pretty far out here," he said. I just nodded because I was used to it. About an hour later, we heard a truck coming down the gravel road. The headlights cut through the trees, and I sat up. "You expecting someone?" I asked. Robert didn't answer right away. Then the truck rolled to a stop, and 2 guys got out. They looked way older, maybe mid-20s. One of them was tall with short hair, and the other had tattoos running down his arms. Robert stood up. "This is Troy and Angus," he said. I didn't know what to say because I hadn't invited them, and I didn't want them there, but I also didn't want to look like a loser. "Hey," I said as they walked up. Me and Robert sat back down by the fire, but Troy and Angus didn't join us. Instead, they started walking around, looking at the house and the shed. "Nice place," Troy said. Angus just looked around and didn't say anything. I shifted in my chair. "You guys want a drink or something?" I asked, mostly just to break the silence. Troy looked over to me. "Nah, we're good." Robert didn't seem bothered by any of this. He just stayed by the fire like nothing was happening. I wanted to tell them to leave, but I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. They wandered around for a while, checking out the property. Eventually, Robert said they had to go, so they got up and left. It was only 9, and Robert had only been there for about an hour, so I was confused. I was expecting that we'd hang out for a lot longer. A few weeks passed, and things went back to normal. I still talked to Robert at school, but he never brought up that night, and I didn't either. He never asked to come over again, and I was fine with that. Then one night, I woke up to the sound of something downstairs. At first I thought it was my grandparents, but then I heard voices. I sat up listening. The voices were low, but I could tell there were at least 3 people. Then I heard the sound of drawers being opened. I climbed out of bed and crept to my door, then I peeked into the hallway. My grandparents' door was shut, so I knew they were still asleep. Then I saw 3 men dressed in dark clothes and masks. One of them was messing with my grandfather's gun safe, while another was rifling through drawers. The third was standing by the back door, looking at his phone. At one point, he adjusted his mask, and I could clearly tell that it was Angus. I didn't have to see the others' faces to know who they were. It was obviously Robert and Troy. Within minutes, they had the safe open. They grabbed several rifles and a shotgun from my grandfather's collection. I wanted to stop them, but I knew that would be a bad idea. Instead, I stayed quiet and let them go. The last thing I wanted was a group of angry guys with guns coming after me. I waited anxiously, and they were gone soon after. When I was sure it was safe, I woke up my grandparents. They called the police and they showed up about an hour later. Even though I knew who robbed us, I didn't tell because I was scared of what they might do to me for snitching. Because of that, they were never caught. What they did with the guns may always be a mystery, because I didn't think it would be easy to sell them. The next day at school, I sat alone at lunch, and Robert didn't even look at me. I never talked to him again. This happened in my last year of high school, so I was 18 years old. I had been going to the same school since freshman year, so I knew most of the people there. I had a solid group of friends, and 2 of them, Adam and Devin, were the ones I spent the most time with. On the first day of senior year, the 3 of us were walking around the school during lunch. We were just talking and catching up after the summer break. It was mostly the same as it had always been, just another year with the same people. As we walked near the back of the school, we saw a guy we didn't recognize. He was sitting on one of the benches near the building, eating lunch by himself. He looked a little older than us, but not by much. He had shaggy brown hair and was wearing a black hoodie, even though it was warm out. When we walked by, he looked up and then looked back down quickly. Devin, being the more outgoing one, walked over to him and said, "Hey man, are you new here?" The guy was still eating, and he swallowed his food before answering. "Yeah, just started today. My name's Taylor." We introduced ourselves and started talking to him. He was easy to get along with and didn't seem shy at all, which was kind of unusual for a new student. He told us he had moved from a town a couple of hours away and was just trying to figure the place out. We ended up sitting with him for the rest of lunch. He had a sarcastic sense of humor, which we liked, and he seemed to know a lot about music and movies, so we had plenty to talk about. By the time the bell rang for the next class, we figured he was a decent guy. We said we'd see him around and then headed off to class. For the next few weeks, we didn't see much of him. Our school wasn't huge, but it was big enough that it was easy to miss someone if they weren't in any of your classes. None of us had any classes with Taylor, and he didn't seem to be in the usual places we hung out. We figured he had just found his own group and left it at that. Then, about a month into the year, we ran into him again at lunch. He was sitting alone at a different table this time, so we went over to say hi. He seemed glad to see us and asked what we'd been up to. We started talking, and after a few minutes, Devin brought up the fact that he was having a party that weekend. His parents were going to be out of town, so he was inviting a few people over to hang out. We weren't planning anything crazy, just some drinks and games. Devin had the idea to invite Taylor, and we all agreed. He seemed excited and said he'd come for sure, so Devin gave him his number and told him the address. Then when the bell rang, we all went our separate ways, and we didn't see Taylor for the rest of the day. The week went by as usual, and when Saturday night rolled around, we headed over to Devin's house. His place was perfect for a party because it was a little outside of town, and his parents didn't have any neighbors nearby. The 3 of us got there early to set things up. We had some beers in the fridge, some snacks out on the table, and a couple of video games loaded up on the TV. For the first couple of hours, it was just a handful of us hanging out. A few more people showed up later, but it never got out of hand. We were expecting maybe 15 people total, and that was about how many came. By midnight, Most people had either left or were getting ready to head out. The party wasn't wild or anything. It was just a fun night with friends. Taylor hadn't shown up, so we figured he had just decided not to come. It wasn't a big deal. Then, right around 1 in the morning, we saw 2 figures walking up the driveway. One of them was Taylor, and the other was a guy none of us had ever seen before. The door swung open, and they both stumbled in. It was immediately clear that they were already drunk. Taylor slurred something as he stepped inside, but it didn't make much sense. The guy with him, who was way older than us, let out a loud laugh and clapped Taylor on the back. He was big, and probably in his 30s, so it was weird that he was at a high school party. He had a big gut, his hair was already thinning, and his face was red. Devin stood up and said, "Hey man, who's this?" Taylor waved a hand lazily. "This is my buddy Rick." Rick looked over at us and slurred,
"Heard there was a party."
We all looked at each other awkwardly. The party was basically over, and nobody had invited this guy. Taylor was at least somewhat our age, but Rick looked like he had no reason to be hanging out with a bunch of high schoolers. "Yeah, it's winding down," Devin said, clearly hoping they would take the hint. Rick wasn't listening, though. He grabbed a beer off the table and cracked it open like he lived there.
"Come on, let's keep it going."
Taylor plopped onto the couch and leaned back like he was settling in. The atmosphere in the room had changed. It had been a relaxed night, but now there was tension. Rick started talking loudly, making weird jokes, but nobody was laughing. Devin pulled me aside and muttered, "Dude, we gotta get them out of here." We tried to steer things toward the end, but Rick wasn't having it. Eventually, Devin said, "All right, man, I think it's time to wrap it up." Rick's expression changed instantly. He glared at Devin.
"What, you kicking us out?"
Taylor didn't say anything. He just stared at the floor. "Yeah, man," Devin said. "It's late." Rick stood up, and for a second, I thought he was going to hit someone. There was a long pause where he was looming over us. I wasn't sure what he was going to do, but it was tense, and he looked mad. Then out of nowhere, he turned and headed for the door. Then as soon as they stepped outside, we heard a loud crash. We ran to the window and saw that Rick had thrown a rock right through it. "Are you kidding me?" Devin shouted. Nobody called the police because Devin was worried about getting in trouble, since his parents didn't know he had a party. The next morning, we cleaned up the mess, and Devin managed to get the window fixed before his parents got back. We never saw Taylor at school again. After everything that happened, we started thinking that maybe he had never actually been a student. He was probably just some random guy hanging around the school. I'm about to go off to college this August at Tulane University, but before I do that, I need to get this story off my chest. I just want to let people know that middle school can be the most troubling years of your life. I was in the 6th grade, and I went to school at Columbia Grammar Prep School in New York, which is one of the oldest schools in the country. I'm still enrolled in that school, and I have been since kindergarten. I've pretty much befriended everyone in my grade throughout all the years, only this one guy made me question why I came to the school in the first place. His name was Jack, and he was new to the school that year. At first he seemed well-mannered, but you can't always underthink. He would sit next to me in all of my classes, and would sit at the same table as me at lunch. I wasn't too sure if he liked me, or if he just wanted to be friends, but I wasn't too worried about it. After some time, he asked for my number, and I gave it to him, thinking he wouldn't be creepy over text. He was normal at first, and we talked about school-related stuff, and current events that were going on in the world. The texts and calls were normal at first, but one day he asked me to go out with him. To be real, I wasn't surprised, because I was expecting him to do it at some point, but I didn't know when. I wasn't offended when he asked, but I politely declined his invitation. After I did this, he ended the call right away. I hoped that I didn't hurt his feelings, but everyone takes things in different ways. I texted him saying, "I'm sorry, Jack, I just don't like you like that." He didn't respond back for the whole night. The next day then came, and we had school. When I saw Jack in school, I tried to talk to him, hoping to sort things out, but he would just ignore me and walk away. I must have really hurt his feelings, but I was still not going to give him what he wanted. The rest of the day went by, and he would continuously avoid me. I went home that night on the school bus, and I noticed that Jack was staring at me from outside when I was sitting down. He looked really cross. I decided right there that I would no longer try to talk to him until he apologized. The next day then came, and I went to school. During the early morning, I was told by one of my teachers that I had to go to the headmaster's office. I was so confused because I didn't know what I could have done. I got to the office and the headmaster told me to have a seat. I listened to him and then asked if I was in trouble. He said, "I was informed that you have been cyberbullying Alex and Jason. Those were 2 kids in my grade." I was so bewildered hearing this and I defended myself. I assured him that I didn't cyberbully them. He then said that he had proof, so he pulled out a piece of paper from his desk and showed me a photo of messages that seemed like cyberbullying. I was so astounded seeing this, and I told the headmaster that this was photoshopped. He then said to me that I had 24 hours to prove that it was fake, and if it's not, I would be suspended for 2 weeks. I had to think fast, so I took a picture of the paper and then left the office. At lunchtime, I went over to Alex and Jason, who were both sitting at the same table. I grabbed both of them and said that I needed them right away. They both squinted their eyes because they obviously didn't know why I needed them. I told them that Jack spread a rumor that I was bullying them. They had very confused expressions on their faces because they didn't know what I was talking about. I then pulled out my phone and showed them the picture. After they saw the photo and examined it, their faces turned to horror. Jason then asked me, "Why would he do something like that to you? What did you do to him?" "I simply didn't do anything," I responded back. He asked me to go out with him, and I nicely rejected him. I guess he didn't take so kindly to that. I continued on. I felt disgusted saying this to them, because it was just plain embarrassing. Alex then said, "We need to go to the office now." We went back to the headmaster's office, and both Alex and Jason said that I was not cyberbullying them. Not only that, but they proved it by showing the headmaster the text message history between me and them. Obviously, our conversations didn't show any bullying. The headmaster seemed to catch on to what we were saying, and he apologized to me for not believing me at first. He also said that I was clear and wouldn't be in trouble. We all thanked him and left the room, continuing on with our day. Later that night, I got an email from the assistant principal saying that Jack had been suspended for a week for spreading misinformation about me cyberbullying other students. I was joyful to hear this because I wouldn't have to run into him at school and be targeted for something I didn't do. Hopefully he would come back more mature and own up to the mistakes he made. The weekend then came, and I was on my way home from dance class. This might be unnecessary information, but I used to be a ballet dancer. I was on my block, walking alone on the sidewalk. I was on my phone when I was suddenly interrupted by a loud,
Hey.
I turned my head to see who it was, and it was none other than Jack. I was so stunned to see him in my neighborhood. How did he even know where I lived? I took a few steps back, feeling unsettled. I calmly asked Jack, "How did you even find me?" He then snapped at me and said,
So you're just not going to go out with me? I was planning this ever since I first met you, and this is how you're going to treat me.
I was about to lose it, but I remained cool because I didn't want to make a scene. I said to Jack, "I wasn't even being mean to you. You just overreacted when I said no, and you spread lies about me which almost got me suspended. Now you're stalking me when I never even told you where I lived. You've gone too far." He was still yelling at me and saying stuff like that I mistreated him. He then put his fists out like he was going to punch me. I started yelling for help because I was being threatened. I started running away, and Jack was chasing me. I ran until I got to the building I lived in. I saw the doorman, and that's when Jack turned around and ran away. He probably knew that he was going to get caught. I got inside, and the doorman asked me who that kid was. I said that he goes to my school, and he was stalking me on my way home. He then asked if he needed to get the police involved. I told him, "No, it's fine, I can handle this," and I went upstairs to my apartment. I rushed inside, and my parents were sitting at the dinner table. They saw the scared look on my face and asked what was the matter. I told them that Jack somehow knew where I lived, and he followed me home from dance class. Both of my parents were so alarmed to hear this, and my mother said that she would email the headmaster right away. It was hard for me to fall asleep that night, knowing what happened a few hours before. I was afraid that he never left, and was still in my neighborhood, waiting for me to come outside. Monday then came, and before the day could even start, I was called into the headmaster's office. I was hoping that it would be good news, and it was. Jack had been expelled from school. This made me feel at ease, because he would no longer be able to follow me everywhere, or harass me anymore. The rest of my middle school years went well and moved fast like the speed of light. I never had any stalker encounters ever again, and I hope it remains that way. I'll say this for those of you who are about to be in middle school. Choose the kids you want to hang out with carefully, because if you don't choose right, you might end up in the same situation I was in. Maybe even worse.